Hello, welcome and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on religion and social justice for refugees. My name is Frank Fredricks and it is my profound privilege to welcome you today. I'm one of the founding members of FRIA, the Forum for Religion and International Affairs, and together with the British Council, we have supported the delivery of the British Council's Bridging Voices program. I will be facilitating today's seminar and I'm honored to introduce the topic of religion and social justice for refugees. First, I want to flag this as a public event and it is being recorded and shared online. There will be a Q&A session following the speakers. However, we encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation via the Q&A feature you'll find there in Zoom. This webinar explores how religion is often identified as a source of conflict, persecution, and displacement in refugee experiences, while acknowledging the awareness among the NGOs, politicians, and academics that religion can and often does play a role in the motivating and framing support for refugees and asylum seekers around the world. This project has brought together leading experts from the US, UK, and beyond to examine the roles that religion plays in promoting social justice for refugees. It emerges out of a collaborative research project involving Yale University, University of College London, Queen Margaret University, Edinburgh, Durham University, University of Birmingham, and other partners as well. It is supported by the British Council's Bridging Voices program with generous support from the Henry Luce Foundation. Today, we will introduce a range of scholars who have contributed to the Religion and Social Justice for Refugees project over the past few years. They include Dr. Zarina Grewal from Yale University, Professor Elena Fidian-Klasmia from University of College London, Dr. Uni Karunakara from Yale University, Professor Catherine Panter-Brick from Yale University, Professor Alistair Ager from Queen Margaret University, Edinburgh, Dr. Louisa Lombard from Yale University, Dr. Anna Rowlands from Durham University, and Professor Lindsay Stonebridge from University of Birmingham. Additional support has also been offered by Aidan Grayrick. As you can imagine, with such an incredible range of contributors and experts, it's a tough job for me as a facilitator to give each of you the welcome and introduction that you deserve and to give justice to that. So to maximize our time we have available today, our contributors have kindly allowed us to share the links to their bios, websites, and staff pages on the webinar chat. We strongly encourage you to take a look at the work of each of these contributors and feel free to follow up with them after the event. To kick us off, I am delighted to welcome the primary investigators of the project, Dr. Zarina Grewal and Professor Elena Fidian-Klasmia, to give us a project overview. Welcome, Zarina and Elena.
Thank you so much, Frank, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. I hope that you can hear me and see me okay. The policy brief that we'll be launching today is the result of our 2-year collaboration, as Frank just indicated, led by myself, Zarina, and Uni, who you'll hear from earlier, with our colleagues who've been named just now by Frank and whose bios will be available to you, but also a range of locally based research colleagues in the 6 countries where our research project has taken place, which are Cameroon, Greece, Malaysia, Mexico, Jordan, and Lebanon. And as you will have already seen from the invitation to join this webinar, we've conducted research in those countries between 2018 and 2019 to examine the roles that local faith communities, faith leaders, and faith-based organizations can and have played in supporting refugees, including a particular focus on the roles played by individuals and communities who have themselves experienced displacement. The project has been particularly relevant and urgent since its inception, and perhaps increasingly so today as well, with reference to 2 intersecting processes of politicization. So firstly, the politicization of religion in debates and policies regarding refugees, and secondly, the politicization of immigration and refugees in debates relating to religion, including debates led by state officials, journalists, and the mainstream media and policymakers. And this politicization has taken numerous forms, both acting as a justification for hostility towards refugees who are perceived to belong to a particular faith, as well as motivating various forms of hospitality towards those who are perceived or who have actual faith identities, which mark them out as ideal refugees. The longer research report, which is available online, is a very comprehensive and, as I say, long discussion of the significance of religion and politics in relation to social justice for refugees, and of the racialization and politicization of refugees and refugee response in diverse geographies and across diverse spaces. Today we'll hear a little bit from some of the case studies discussed in the project, but we can't cover all 6 of them. But just to provide a brief background to our case selection, as it were, and to situate the research before turning to Zarina for her words of introduction as well. The case studies that we selected explore the situations and the responses both to and by members of protracted refugee communities in a range of countries, which have both majority Muslim and Christian host communities across the major refugee producing and refugee hosting regions around the world. The research was primarily, although not exclusively, conducted in major cities and towns rather than in refugee camps, given that displacement is increasingly urban in nature, as we know. Nonetheless, we have also conducted research in a number of camp contexts, including, as Zarina may mention now, in the island of Lesbos, as well as in my own research in a protracted refugee camp in North Lebanon. The refugee communities which we conducted research with were all facing major risks, such as forced repatriation, travel bans, pushbacks, denial of legal status, and/or deportation measures, providing a very important opportunity to explore the roles that religion can play in supporting refugees in such contexts of precarity, situations of precarity which have been enhanced, unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll now turn over to Zarina for her words of welcome, and I look forward to our discussions afterwards. Thank you.
Zarina, you may want to unmute yourself.
Sorry. First of all, good morning, everyone, and thank you. It's been such a pleasure to work with the whole team on what is such an urgent and topic that we are all deeply invested in, and particularly appreciate the leadership of Elena and her clear-eyed analysis throughout, and thoughtfulness in thinking through many of these problems. So when we conceived of the project, we wanted to have our work try to shift us away from the moral language of hospitality and sanctuary for refugees that often eclipses the legal language of human rights that so we find ourselves talking about immigration as sort of this highly politicized issue. And I have to say, as someone who worked in Greece, the news coming out of Lesbos this week with the Moria camp burned to the ground already was a hellish place, and now the situation is much more dire than even it was before. And so it really, reminds us the importance of thinking about these issues as political problems, and not moral problems of deficient care or deficient compassion or generosity. There are really dangerous consequences to kind of routinely representing refugees as a societal burden, as a source of political crisis, and to treating asylum as a humanitarian favor rather than a right. Because as we're seeing in Lesbos right now, hospitality has a fleeting temporality. There's a kind of precarious condition of being a guest requires that one leaves before wearing out one's welcome. And we see that the local Greek population, sort of rising up and protesting, and solidarity breaking down in these moments. And so that we really wanted to kind of think carefully about the politics, and to think of refugees as political subjects, and to think about their own organizing, their own networks of care, their own internal political debates and differences, because they certainly don't all share one politics. And then there was the question of religion. So Elena's already referenced how, religion can be seen as a source of conflict, and is a source of conflict sometimes between refugees. I have to say that camps like Moria exacerbate conflicts across all range of differences, including religious difference. And then we also, in my own research in Greece, looking at groups like Jafra or the Afghan community, Lesbos Solidarity, City Plaza, other kinds of scenarios where actually there was a lot of solidarity across religious lines. I also just wanted to say that, one of our really, I think, important through lines throughout the project is that religion is not just one thing, it's so many different things. Sometimes it's a moral resource, sometimes it's a source of solidarity, and sometimes it's a source of conflict. It is one religion, it's one identity that intersects with a number of other identities. And it can also be, of course, a racialized identity in the context of many of the refugees who may or may not be Muslim, but are racialized as such in a place like Greece. As state and regimes of care shore up the border, they reproduce inequalities and create the new racial, gendered, ethnic, and geopolitical hierarchies that also intersect with religion. This is part of what we're looking at. And I also would say that my own work, just really briefly in Greece, also expanded what we might consider human rights. It's in addition to shelter, and we can think of the 12,000 in Lesbos that right now are without shelter, desperately need it, and the need for asylum and the right. We talk about all these things in the context of human rights, but looking at the ways in which refugees advocated for one another and supported one another. For example, when a young Afghani boy died suddenly in Moria camp, the way the Afghan refugees came together, pooled their resources so that he could have a proper Islamic burial, really expanded my own understanding of what we even consider right, human rights or the rights of refugees. What are we advocating for? The right to die with dignity and in a way that respects one's faith needs or religious needs. That is not something that's often taken into consideration. So I think, as you'll hear today, many of our colleagues in the course of their research were able to capture, even though this was, a multi-site study and a kind of preliminary pilot study, we were able to capture really the wide range of diverse ways in which religion intersects with the refugee social justice work. So I will pass it on to my colleague, Alastair, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Zarina. And it's been my great pleasure over the last few weeks to work with colleagues engaged in the 6 case studies to pull together a policy brief which will be communicating some of the key messages across these settings. And although the seminar is a principal opportunity to go a little bit deeper into 2 of those case studies, I just wanted to reflect on what began to come out as some of the key messages, and as you listen to the rest of the presentations, perhaps make you mindful of some of these key messages or potential response to the findings across clearly very diverse settings. But I want to suggest, if you look at our recommendations, that there are 3 actions which we're essentially encouraging people to reflect on. The first action is one of recognition, essentially, which is to understand the depth, the nuance, the complexity, the embeddedness of religious engagement within refugee communities and within the communities that are often abutting the experience of refugees. And this is a pretty low level threshold of engagement, but I think the papers work as a powerful advocacy to document the depth of engagement. It was not long ago I was involved in leading the work in Jordan, where I was advised that it was not worth one of my research assistant colleagues traveling to northern Jordan during Ramadan, because there was not much humanitarian work going on during Ramadan. Well, there may not have been from the Western agencies, but at a local level and amongst community-based organizations, it was very, very active. So there's a sense of a blindness and invisibility because of the embeddedness of this engagement within communities. That at the very least, we want the case studies to be able to lead people to recognize the depth, the quality, the energy and the dynamism of this community engagement. And at the very least, to respect and not interfere with, and to see that the value and the contribution of that, even if there is not an engagement. The second thing we'd probably want you to reflect on is thinking for agencies that are involved in other forms of social justice, potentially from a secular framing, of the call to utilize or engage with colleagues that are working with faith groups, or to engage with the religious experience of actors. And we're acknowledging the weighing and the complexity of that, but there are a number of instances, and there's a call within the recommendations to reflect on the potential synergy and how faith teachings relate to the rights and dignity of refugees are compatible with international secular values, to rather than presume a religious secular divide, to find common cause in many of these situations. Although I use the word utilize there, some may actually see that the appropriate word is instrumentalize, and might caution that idea of secular agencies using religious engagement and religious communities as a way of furthering their own ends, but not fully engaging with the understanding of religious experience as it is within local communities. And we recognize that risk. And the third call, which is the most ambitious call, which is done with some tentativeness, but with some authority, is to see agencies engaged in work with displaced communities, acknowledging and recognizing the engagement with religion to be something that is transformative of their own understanding of humanitarian experience, in terms of the dignity, in terms of the humaneness, in terms of the solidarity and those functions, to learn something and share something with religious communities that are working there at the front line. So listen out for recommendations or implications that for you might seem one of simply recognizing, or it might be something more about utilizing and finding common cause, or hopefully some of it might be more challenging than that, to be transformative and to change the way that others may think of support for displaced communities in a way that's informed by this work. So I'm delighted now to hand over, I think, first to Uni Karunakara and then to Catherine Pantabrick, who will take us through two of these case studies in a little bit more detail. Over to you, Uni.
Thank you, Alistair. So I want to first start by thanking the British Council and the Henry Luce Foundation for making it possible for researchers at Yale and other universities, especially UCL. Together, we were able to conduct over 300 interviews in 6 countries to better understand the role that religion plays in motivating individuals, communities, and organizations in promoting social justice for refugees. Now, I personally speak from the perspective of a public health professional, a humanitarian worker, and a researcher with extensive experience in the delivery of assistance to individuals and communities that have been affected by conflicts, disasters, epidemics, and neglect. I was personally responsible for coordinating with a local researcher and carrying out the research in Malaysia. Now, at the time we carried out the research, there were 164,620 registered refugees and asylum seekers in Malaysia. So these are figures from January of last year. Now, out of these, 142,370 were from Myanmar, mainly Rohingya refugees, but not just Rohingya refugees, but also Chins, Muslims, Rakhines, Arakanese, and other ethnicities as well. Now, 22,250 refugees and asylum seekers were from other countries like Pakistan, Yemen, Syria, Somalia, Sri Lanka, Afghan, Iraq, Palestine, etc. Now, 67% were men, and 42,750 were below the age of 18. So that gives you a sense of the refugee, sort of the acknowledged and registered number of refugees in Malaysia. Now, you have to keep in mind that Malaysia is not a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. So what they have in the country is a managed refugee registration process led by UNHCR. Now, the Rohingya presence, despite being an Islamic state, Rohingya presence is tolerated, but no legal rights to work or mainstream education exists for refugees at that time, even though political parties have promised that that would change. Now, significant barriers to healthcare, as the Ministry of Health makes it insists that the doctors report undocumented individuals to immigration, and most refugees live in dense urban areas in high-rise apartments with poor living conditions. As Elena said earlier, increasingly, a lot of the refugees are living in sort of urban condition, urban environments, making it also difficult sometimes to access them, to better understand their living situation, etc. Now, very quickly, I wanted to talk about, when we talk about social justice, what is it that we mean? Now, for me and for us, promoting social justice involves the upholding of two principles: the principle of humanity, that all humans have equal worth and are deserving of dignity and respect, so equal worth. Um, and the principle of impartiality, that assistance is provided in a fair and equitable manner. So equity, fairness, dignity, equality, they're all very important sort of considerations for organizations striving for social justice. Now, religion, as was said earlier, has been the cause of much persecution, violence, and forced migration throughout history. And refugees continue to experience insecurity, marginalization, precarity while in transit, or also in the countries where they seek asylum and refuge. Having said that, religion and faith are an important source of strength, comfort, and support for individuals and communities when faced with extreme distress and precarity. And moreover, religion and faith also very often form the basis for new connections, networks, and assembly in foreign lands. Now, in carrying out the research, we had a couple of challenges. The main of these were the identity of the researcher, whether race, religion, nationality, gender, etc., impacted access to interview access to individuals as well as representatives of organizations and governments. In some instances, refugees and representatives of organizations were quite reluctant to speak with researchers due to real or perceived political and religious sensitivities. Now, key insights. Religion and faith often motivate support for and solidarity with refugee and asylum seekers. And this we see not just in Malaysia, where we did the interviews, but also across all of the countries where we carried out interviews. Now, important to remember is that states tend to limit space for support and solidarity for refugees, as they are often seen as political liabilities and or security threats. So this is true even in an Islamic state as Malaysia hosting Muslim refugees. Now, religion and faith can be compelling motivators for individuals, host communities, and faith-based organizations to come to the aid of refugees and stand in solidarity with them. But the space for such action is not a given, has to be claimed, often against great odds. Now, states, multilateral agencies, and humanitarian organizations must explicitly recognize and operationalize Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that guarantees individuals the right of religion, worship, and observance. Now, this necessitates the creation of safe environments where refugees can not only live, but also die in dignity in accordance with their religious beliefs. Individuals and communities must have access to religious education from qualified and knowledgeable sources. And this is something that came up again and again in interviews in Malaysia, access to religious education. And in their words, free access to such education may increase school enrollment, prevent child marriage, and clarify religious beliefs versus cultural practices. For example, family planning. And while increasing space for observance of religion and faith, we must also guard against the instrumentalization of religion by states and agencies for political and operational purposes. These are my comments, and I'll hand over to Catherine. Catherine?
Thank you, Winnie. Thank you. So my fieldwork was on the US-Mexico border, in 3 border areas on both sides of the border, San Diego and Tijuana, El Paso and Juarez, and Houston, McMillan, and Brownsville. And those regions are known for a border surge of migrants, principally Central American migrants. What's particularly interesting about this context, as Uni has mentioned, is the role of the state, in the sense that the US remains at this border steeped in an immigration crisis. And under the Trump administration, raids, detention, and deportations have escalated to unprecedented levels. I'll give you 2 examples. In 2018, there was the zero tolerance policy, which was really geared to separating families with their children with no clear means of family reunion. And in 2019, migrant protection protocols were enacted to basically remove migrants as fast as possible to the border for them to expedite a process of refoulement, with enormous implications for humanitarian needs and even coronavirus exposure. So the way that the border people see this, as told in the 133 interviews I did on that border area, is that these are anti-immigrant action, these are anti-asylum border policies, and these are years of surveillance, detention, and mass deportation, which have given rise to migrant justice movements to counter the criminalization of what is known as the 1325 unlawful entry charge, a misdemeanor. So my point here to start with as a context is that the border, the US-Mexico border, is a site of surveillance, detention, mass deportation, and a site of faith-based and civic resistance to the criminalization of migrants. And to the point that I think Alistair was making, the faith-based and the civic organizations have common purpose in reimagining and putting in place a fairer immigration policy. So my fieldwork was really to ask, how does solidarity, social justice, and faith guide humanitarian work, or the practice and the meaning of humanitarian work at the border? And I just want to give you 2 insights briefly. First of all, the demands for justice for migrants are framed as demands of solidarity and vice versa. But you've got many different conflicting notions of justice and solidarity on this border. To give you one example, the Border Patrol agents stand in solidarity with the nation state, and they take personal risks to patrol a frontier that is seen and defend the political narrative of migrant invasion. Faith-based organization and civic organization also stand together ready for collective action, and they want, some of them espouse a very interesting Catholic liberation theology, which is for social justice of migrants. And others, perhaps the evangelical churches, call for a radical conversion to Christ, but not draw the line at crossing federal law. The point I'm making is that all these acts of solidarity and social justice for migrants can be criminalized by the state. It is risky for somebody to engage in solidarity with migrants. So for faith-based actors, if you ask them what does social justice mean, they will say that justice is about the basics of life and shelter, but it's also about giving people a voice in the world. And one phrase that I really like is just that they said, be a voice for the voiceless. And that's the idea of recognition that people are at the margins of society. What's interesting is that the solidarity towards migrants is not really linked to compassion and pity, but it's linked to action and political struggle. It is, as one articulator told me, it is more than charity on behalf of the other. It is action with the other. It is power with the people, not power over the people. Cause of the solidarity takes on a political and a structural dimension. It is because people do recognize here that compassion itself does very little to change harmful power differentials in the region in the context of detention. If you extend help to a person in need, you remain safe, clothed, and sheltered. You have to do more than here's a blanket, a taco, and good luck. So they're very steeped into this combative notion or agonistic notion of solidarity. And so everything is political struggle. The second point is about the role of faith. For many people of faith, social justice advocacy is a way of putting their faith in action. One of the directors of a migrant shelter for me expressed it beautifully, faith very succinctly. He said, faith is a conviction, the belief you can change things. I have faith that the world can welcome change. In other words, faith is not a private matter. It is rooted in social action for and behalf with the community. And when speaking about the role of faith in migrant advocacy, faith leaders are very explicit that it is a time for reimagining and remoralizing the discourse on immigration and to establish coalitions in the area to urge comprehensive policy reform. Here, faith is defined as a conviction that the world can change. It is enacted and it's interestingly rooted in love for one's neighbor as opposed to fear. So that to me is really outstanding and transformative. As Alistair said, for me the surprising thing was, this combative solidarity and this faith rooted in love, which is not, it's a harsh love. People say in this area that you have to cultivate courage, you have to cultivate political courage to stand up to the toxic power structures, and that you have to cultivate anger, rage at the injustice of this world. So to conclude, what I got out of this 2018 and 2019 fieldwork on the border is that for many humanitarians, faith, rather than just religion, faith in humanity and morality, faith helps you to express a radical message against the injustice of the world. And even hospitality is radical because it opens you up to acts of retaliation. So it opens you up to risks when you're fighting against a context of, of surveillance of border communities. So I find this a really interesting context, really, where, we talk about power with the people in a combative way to reform noxious policies targeting borderland communities and border crossers. Now I hand over to
Alton. Thank you, Catherine, so much for your illuminating remarks. There's so much from everything that's been said that we can reflect on together. Before we get into reconvening and synthesizing with the team, I just want to invite all of our participants to begin submitting questions if you haven't begun already. Because we're gonna, after this discussion here, we're gonna have for a few minutes, we're gonna switch to the question and answer. And we'd love to be able to get to any questions or ponderings people have. So feel free to submit those in the Q&A function of Zoom. So before, to sort of frame the conversation we can have here, I noticed there's a couple of key themes that have come out from all of the reflections that we just heard. And the one that stood out to me most dramatically was this difference between looking at social justice for refugees as a moral issue versus a legal issue versus a political issue. And I can't help but think of some of the challenges that come up in terms of, gaps between moral psychology in terms of what individuals feel is right or wrong, and ethical philosophy frameworks that inform the laws that are often being supported here. And so my question to the research team is, in what ways is religion and religious actors filling that gap? And perhaps what areas are religious narratives, religious actors failing to do so between the sort of hyper-rational legal frameworks and the sort of the moral motivating, but often sometimes misled or unsustained efforts that come from those, if those exist? What are some of the strengths and weaknesses? And I'll turn to Zarina first if you'd like to give some remarks, and then anyone who'd like to speak to that, we'll pass the mic, so to speak. Serena, do you have anything on this that you'd like to share?
Yes, sorry, I was muted. Yes.
No worries.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that, you know, the issue is that, as I was trying to say earlier, depoliticized framings of refugees as in terms of crisis, what it does is it reproduces sort of these one-dimensional representations of refugees as either victims in need of rescue or foreign subjects unfit for democratic citizenship, or as a political, cultural threat to the dominant majority's way of life. And that was something that I found again and again in my work in Greece. And so for me, looking at religion was not you know, in order to sort of, I mean, it's already a fraught category because so many of the refugees do feel like they're primarily understood as Muslims, even when they're not Muslims. I encountered many atheist refugees, or who didn't have any religion, or people who had converted to Christianity, but and often in contact with evangelical missionaries in the U.S. Who were meeting them in Greece and supporting them. And in fact, one of the Afghani churches that I was looking at in Athens is supported by numerous American evangelical institutions. So this is all very political. There's no way to evacuate the politics from this. But I think that sometimes when we talk about it in terms of just that moral pull, and as opposed to obligation, we aren't able to move the policy needle to the point of change. I mean, right now we might look at the images coming out of Lesbos, but the reality is that people need shelter, asylum, and it's not just the problem of Greece. We need all of these other countries to also open up and give asylum to many of these people that are now stranded and sleeping in the street. When we talk about hospitality and we frame it in that way, and I think Catherine was getting at it in a different angle, but what I'm talking about is that, you know, right now, the way much of the kind of pushback in Lesbos is in terms of, well, we have already been hospitable enough. There's a saturation point and we've hit it. When we're talking about legal rights, it's about obligation. So you create the wars that create the refugees, and then you act like they're a burden when they show up in Europe. This is, you know, these things are all connected. So to me, the turn to religion is to actually try to resist that depoliticization. And I have to say that the networks of solidarity I encountered were sometimes Islamic, sometimes Marxist anarchist, sometimes you know, global Palestinian solidarity networks in Jafra, and sometimes all three. And sometimes those things could live together. There's also this understanding that you know, these are kind of discrete kinds of logics refugees draw on as they frame their understandings of solidarity, and that's not the case. There actually is a lot of fluidity and crossing across these kinds of networks.
Thank you. And would any of the other research partners like to speak to that?
Sure. I mean, I have to say on the Mexico border, in stark contrast, it's because, you know, UNHCR cannot step in because the borders have not been declared a zone of emergency, and because the state is unwilling to provide both Mexico and the US. It's only the faith-based organization and civic organization that step up to the plate working together, and it's a different type of religious frame. But what they are saying, to answer to your question, is that they're knitting together political struggle with a discourse on humanity and morality very, very strongly. They see that as the 2 feet of love, if you want, for Christian social justice teachings. So that they are much more, you know, so these two ideas of humanity and morality and justice are just entwining in a much more explicit way in this area. And, you know, a lot of people, interestingly enough, just avoided the word religion and avoided the word refugee to talk about faith and to talk about migrants. So it's a slightly, it's quite a different context altogether. The art and the beauty would be analytically to be able to draw lessons from such diverse areas. And you know, this is perhaps for me, this is the way. For me, the way is solidarity is not shared experience; it's action. It's what you do for people. So you can have diverse solidarity networks, bringing together people from different faiths or different ethnicities and different backgrounds. It's what you do together for the other that matters for solidarity networks, not whether you have a shared experience of religion or migration. Or maybe that's contested, but that's how I see the fieldwork in the US-Mexico border.
That's fascinating. Uni, did you have something you want to add to that?
Well, just one sentence. Faith motivates. The action has to be essentially political, or there has to be a political framing of what needs to be changed, what needs to change. So that's something that you especially comes out very strongly in the work that Catherine has done, but also what Zarina said earlier. That many networks are motivated by faith, by politics, by ideology, but essentially they all have to have a political frame for action and solidarity.
I find this to be a very fascinating sort of new topic that the last three remarks have all sort of illuminated. And it reminds me much of the framework around mutual aid networks that are popping up across the United States right now, and this idea of solidarity, not charity. And what I find fascinating about it is, in my own volunteer work just here in Queens, where I'm based, we've had very similar conversations around some folks seeing it as everything is inherently political, and other folks, and perhaps maybe I fall into another campus, I see this as expression of my ethical philosophy or religious duty even. And so in this intersection between the two, to reflect back, all of you, do you find that there's a framework that of motivation or of mobilization that is more or less productive to actually leading to better outcomes for the populations being served? In other words, is there a model that seems to be of how people either individually or organizationally orient themselves to the challenge around asylum seeking that seems to improve those outcomes? If you can even see that. I know that might be beyond the purview of the research.
But, Frank, to throw it back at you, you said you see it as a religious duty. That I understand, but then to actually operationalize it, you still need to have a political understanding, a root cause understanding of what is causing these problems. And that's what I mean. The frame has to be political. And I don't mean big P politics as in party politics, but it is necessarily all about creating change. And that's inherently political.
I value that, and actually I agree with you. I wonder, for the sake of the conversation, if I could explore, and if people want to explore, does the actor working on the issue of refugee issues need to see themselves as a political actor in order to be productive in that space? I'm not sure if that's an assumption I can make. I'd love to hear from folks on this subject.
I can come in briefly on that, Frank. In looking across the 6 case studies, one's hugely impacted by the variance of context and the variance of religious expression. And just to example, in our work in Jordan and Lebanon, aware of the depth of religious commitment and faith influencing action, its embeddedness, its implicitness was so strong. It was actually a major challenge of researchers to elicit it. It was so much part of the everyday that to label it as a religious commitment rather than a social or a personal engagement or personal identity was particularly challenging. So it seems to me that, to answer your question, it works in very, very different ways. And I recognize the sort of context in which Catherine is speaking, where I think there is an energy and an awareness of that religious commitment opposing a political regime and being seen explicitly as political. But I'm also aware of many other contexts where, to follow up your question, the acts of, and I'll go back to things like the acts of hospitality and solidarity and support would not be seen as political primarily, but are potentially deeply so, because they create alliances, they create relationships which subvert the narrative of difference and of conflict. So I also find that the way the conversation has gone interesting in terms of recognizing the political nature, and I support Uni in his contention that every act to be acted has got to be a political act. But I think that part of the point is it may not be labeled by the agent as such. We as analysts might perceive it to be. So, and I think probably rightly, but I think it's often understood in very, very different ways, and certainly in some contexts, not explicitly political act. That's something else. That's an area of politics that I don't engage in. I engage as a Muslim or as an evangelical in this mission, even though we would recognize that as politically active.
So if I can just jump in there, I mean, I think what I just wanted to emphasize is that you know, when I was saying that the communities that I was looking at, that I was looking at them as political subjects, it's because they see themselves as political subjects. So just to give a quick example, you know, when there was I was there during the protest of the EU-Turkey deal, you know, Athens, of course, full of refugees from, you know, protesting. And one small group that had been interviewing, they were carrying a large sign that said in Arabic, it said in English, capitalism is, and then in Arabic, haram meaning sinful. So, you know, that they are making a religious statement about capitalism, you know, this particular moment. You know, they are. It is a religious enunciation of critique, and so it's political and it's also religious. Those two things can exist in the same space, and sometimes they get separated in certain cases, and that's what I'm hearing from my colleagues. But I would say that what I found in the field and the people that I interviewed, because they are in this work of trying to create networks of mutual care, trying to create, you know, drawing on concepts like baraka or the ummah to kind of imagine shared futures when they're living amongst strangers that they've been thrown together with, you know. So those become political formations, and that's not simply me as an analyst saying that, that's how they articulate it.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to present one more topic to you all before we get to the question and answer. And just a reminder for folks, feel free to submit more questions for the panels. We're about to switch over to that soon. So my question for everyone on the research team or anyone who feels comfortable sharing, I can imagine such an intense engagement with the subject likely has illuminated new things to you. And not only has this project perhaps changed you, but the world has also changed pretty dramatically since this research began. So in what ways do you feel changed by this, or what has been sort of revealed to you through this as it relates to the world that we're living in today? If anyone feels comfortable sharing on that. I know I give you guys a slightly heavier question.
No, I would like to tackle this question because one of the things I looked at was the emotional landscape of humanitarian work. And having worked in Afghanistan and also in Jordan with refugees a while ago, it was really metering out this idea of hope in a better future, hope that my children would have a better future than I, hope that refugee return is going to be a better place than where I am, etc. So it was steeped in hope, right? And there's nothing wrong with hope because it keeps you going, and it's social hope. It's not, you know, the idea that the future will be better, but the idea that I will have human dignity in the place that I will be for my children. When I went to the US-Mexico border, I don't find much hope. I find rage. You know, I find anger. I find courage. And so it's a very different, I mean, your question just sparked that transformation for me, because it's as we said, much more political. You don't have to hear the word political in the sentence to understand that the struggle is social and political and economic in particular, because this is one of the most biggest region of inequality in the US. So I can't remember why I just sparked that contrast. The contrast for me was, you know, whether you provide hope in a better future or whether you rage against the injustice of the present.
if I can
Justice of the present is a I think that's a very powerful phrase. Zarina, feel free to go with it.
May I just add to what Catherine said? There's a huge difference in how Catholic liberation theologians react to the situation on the border to, say, Christian evangelicals and at the same border. So within the same religion, you have different ways of seeing things, and one group is much more likely not to question authority, not to question the state, while others have a long tradition of questioning authority and power. So that's also something to keep in mind, that you might be presented with that in many situations, in many contexts.
Sorry, the rage I find is very often with the civic organizations, because the faith-based organization talk about courage rather than rage, but it's the same stem of the word. So I just want to say, I know what you're saying is completely true, but they coalesce and they work with civic organizations that are much more overtly combative. But the faith-based organizations, for instance, if they take money from the state for churches, etc., will have to mute a little bit of that combative language. Serena, I interrupted you, sorry.
Oh, yeah, no, I just wanted to just, on the question of being transformed by this research, I think I can honestly say this project has been so transformative for me in so many ways, not least of the relationships that I developed. And in fact, this morning I was speaking to a Palestinian living in Athens, who now works on a farm outside of Athens and sells, it's a refugee-run kind of collective project where they are running a organic farm. But he had been in Moria, and I met him in both places. Part of, so it was the relationships, it's also really forced me to reconsider my own preconceived notions about the conditions, how desperation is linked to acting in self-interest. That is really what has been most transformative for me, is that finding that one of the most remarkable things that I would never have anticipated, being in the camp, seeing the kind of fictive kinship, or the kind of families that are formed through the circumstances of being in a camp with strangers. One friend gets the papers to be able to leave and go to Athens. The other one is stuck in Moria, and they stay back. They wait for their friend, even though they're living under such harsh conditions, to be willing, out of loyalty to someone you've only known for a few months. I mean, that's just, it's really remarkable, and really forced me to rethink. At least I imagined that desperate conditions bring out the worst in us, and it's been extraordinary to see through this research how the extremely cruel policies of deterrence and detention, bring out for so many people incredible generosity and care, and not acting in self-interest, but actually, and it's out of this sense of connection to one another that's often religious.
Thank you for sharing. And with that, we're going to switch to the question and answer. The first question we have is from Jacqueline. She wanted to know if the team had a chance to explore sort of what religion and religious actors are doing to prevent the push forces towards folks becoming refugees. That might be outside the purview of your research, but I was just curious if there was, she's curious if there's any site of religious action towards reducing push factors of creating asylum seekers.
Well, in the Rohingya context, I know that there's quite some action from Buddhist networks to try and influence fascist Buddhist monks in Myanmar, who have been in the forefront of propagating a certain narrative about Rohingyas and pushing them out of their homes and causing them to flee. Dalai Lama famously said that he had tried several times to reach out to these monks, but it's a different branch of Buddhism, and in Myanmar In Sri Lanka and Thailand, I think they practice a different Buddhism, and Dalai Lama does not have that much influence there. So there are these efforts to reach out through Buddhist networks in different countries to reach out to Buddhist leaders in Myanmar. But so far, it hasn't led to, I mean, people are still leaving in large numbers. So, and you have millions living in Bangladesh and in other countries in the region. So not much success so far.
Any other thoughts on this one?
I mean, I would just say that, as I said before, you know, for many of the refugees, they're there because of wars and the anti-war efforts. I mean, they're constantly talking about the wars being wrong, the wars being, I mean, they're protesting. They routinely do that kind of work. But in the example that I just gave a few moments ago about, you know, the capitalism is haram poster, there's also this idea that economic strangulation. Some people are migrants or economic migrants, and this idea of like the ways in which, and also climate migrants, right? So many of the sub-Saharan Africans are coming because they have to leave. They're in places that are no longer inhabitable. And we're, you know, in this moment in the U.S., my friends just the other few days ago were waking up in the Bay Area on planet Mars. So, you know, there's intersecting crises, and you know, the refugees have a very clear critique that is, I think, quite politically pointed that I encountered about all of these issues, whether it's you know, the ravages of capitalism, climate change, wars, and the injustice of the EU-Turkey deal.
Hot peace, as I call it.
Hot peace?
Yeah, I mean, hot peace is a term that's been used in another context, and I find it quite relevant here when we talk about exactly what Zarina said. You're talking about the negative impacts of globalization, the climate crisis, and also apocalyptic sort of nationalism, you know, all sorts of things going on, political, economic, and environmental. So we live in peaceful times. There's no sort of formal declaration of war, but at the same time, we are constantly in a state of conflict and crisis. And that's, I mean, we are beginning to feel it. It's not just refugees and migrants who they have felt it for many years, but now we are all feeling it acutely. So yeah, that's where we are.
And I think we have time for one more question. We have a question from Michael, who asks, are there any examples of asylum seekers connecting to religious organizations in those countries that they are temporarily or perhaps settling in to then collaborate towards advocating for policy changes that are harmful to asylum seekers? That's the sort of my understanding of the question, is that collaboration between those who've arrived to the faith communities and advocating for law change.
Well, I will just say that in my own case, most of the organizations that I was looking at were refugee run, and they were not supported. They were not usually local Greek institutions, but actually organizations, grassroots organizations started by refugees and run by refugees. The only, one example that I'm thinking of actually is a counterexample to the question. The Afghan church that I visited and interviewed people at in Athens, they were the only refugees that I encountered who were not going out to protest the EU-Turkey deal. And they were very evasive about why that might be. But it did seem to me that something about their larger ties to a kind of global evangelical politics made them less, although they supported they supported the general premise, they were less inclined to be out there in the streets with everybody else. And so that really was quite striking to me.
Frank, I saw a question from Michael, it may have been part of that, about engagement with opportunities for larger multilateral or NGO organizations to engage with the phenomenon that we were talking about. a couple of reflections there. So, Michael, I would refer you to the full report. It's much more detailed and gives examples. I wanted to, again, just perhaps focus on a couple of words. One of the, I work quite a lot with multilateral, bilateral agencies with understanding how they can connect with something of the energy, the force, the solidarity that we've been talking about. And there clearly is quite a gulf for a number of pragmatic operational reasons there. But I want to suggest that the first thing that multilateral NGOs could do is listen. Again, vivid from Jordan was the fact that many of you may know the cluster system for organizing humanitarian assistance, which notionally provides a way of connecting with local response. In Jordan, that tended to be convened on Friday afternoons, which suited the expatriate agencies, but really didn't suit Friday prayers and local religious organizations. And the whole structure and culture of those meetings were ones that were not listening really at all. So I think any agency that's operating in an area that really wants to engage with this has to first listen and relate. I might post in the chat. I've been involved in the development of some guidelines for organizations to provide faith-sensitive mental health supports, and the mental health supports is almost irrelevant in this context. It's understanding what would faith-sensitive delivery be, and that means again to listen and to map the needs and the resources and the perspectives of refugees themselves, rather than presume upon the format and the approach and the culture of intervention. So I think there's a little bit of unthinking of existing approaches and ones that genuinely open themselves to be rooted in partnership with local organizations and very small local faith groups and other civic organizations with society that are playing a very important role, but often not effectively mapped by NGOs and multilateral partners.
A lot of moving pieces. Does anyone else want to share in this? If not, I think we have time for one more question. All right, our final question comes from Emma, who particularly wants to direct her question to Catherine. And she asks, can you say anything more about solidarity with other organizations in spite of difference rather than based on a shared social identity? So maybe not even just organizations, just difference in general. Catherine, do you have anything on that you would like to share?
Well, I'll give you first of all an example of complicating solidarity based on sameness. First of all, a border patrol agent I interviewed was Cuban, Catholic, and was working to patrol the frontier. And so the point is that he, espoused a different notion of solidarity with the US as opposed to with his, with his transnational and faith group. Meaning that you can, this is what I'm saying about solidarity is what you do rather than where you come from and what faith you hold. And that's an idea of different notions of solidarity actually antagonistic to each other within the same space because the border space is so complicated. Now, solidarity with difference, which also answers the question before, they are, border communities that organize, for instance, the Homeland Security Conference every year, where people join, and they're a conference of scholars, for policymakers, for law enforcement officials, and for activists in order to have dialogue around issues, in not necessarily, to work on behalf of a better immigration policy. A better immigration policy is not necessarily one that will always be in favor of irregular migration. And then also border awareness experiences where people are hosting a diverse group of people from the United States and elsewhere to come to the border, because they say, come and see what we have. Your preconceptions of the border are, come and see the reality of what it is. And it steeps you into a more, a better grounded reality and shared experience. So people who have done that might go to testify to Congress So you don't need, you have migrants testifying to Congress, you have prison solidarity volunteers testifying to Congress, you have legal advocates testifying to Congress. The point I think I'm making is that there may be differences in shared experience, but a really grounded reality of what's on the border. And what was striking to me, for instance, is to find people whose land was going to be seized by a border wall be completely, fired up for a long, long time, given that the movements with migrants have been historically there for a very long time. So a long way to answer your question, that really solidarity, I think, is banding together to do something and stand up for something in the face of threat or risk, but it doesn't necessarily come from a shared identity to start with. It is a coalition. It is a call for action. You don't need to be the same, and you don't have to be, you don't need to be the same, but you need to be able to fight for the same change. And the change is here, in this context, a fairer immigration policy that will restore border lines to some kind of normalcy, because otherwise it feels like an incredibly militarized area, very far from the heart, the politics.
Thank you for sharing. I mean, that reminds me actually of a conversation I once had with Jonathan Haidt. And when you've described, for instance, the border control agent who is of Cuban origin, I think of Putnam's bonding and bridge social capital in terms of who are we bonding with, what in-groups are we creating, and how does that maybe defy expectation? And when I had a chance to meet with Jonathan Haidt and talk about his work around moral capital, which he sort of metaphorically extends from Putnam's work, the first thing I asked him is, do you believe that there is bridging or bonding moral capital like there is social capital? And there wasn't really, he didn't have an answer for that at that moment. Maybe it's something they're exploring, but it reminds me of this, is that perhaps the moralization process is leading to new coalitions and people creating new in-groups, while simultaneously that inherently means there's going to be an out-group that's going to require more work to be done to bridge. And so as we shift now to the closing, I just want to illuminate or reflect back our appreciation and the incredible reflection that was presented both in the work that was done and in the conversation today, whether we're talking about moralization and religious identity or politicalization and the state of these laws. And it seems like we're just at the beginning of the work that could be done to explore these themes and then find this insight to be applied in the field and in our communities to improve the laws, the services, the way that we engage in all of these aspects of the refugee experience. So thank you to everyone. I want to thank the research team, including everyone who spoke, Elena, Zarina, Alistair, Uni, and Catherine, for your reflections and contributions. Thank you everyone who joined and submitted questions. As a reminder, you will shortly receive an email in your inbox with the project's final policy report. And in that email, you'll also find a short survey that will be used by the British Council to evaluate the quality of the project in today's webinar. This is anonymous and the data will only be used to independently assess the program, but we'd be very grateful if you could just take a few minutes to fill that out. Finally, our thanks go to the British Council US and to the Henry Luce Foundation for supporting this important research and project, and we hope that you find it intriguing and meaningful. Lastly, thank you all again for joining. Whichever side of the Atlantic you are joining us from, we wish you a wonderful day ahead.